Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Mark, for the privilege of being here today. Every time I need a shot in the arm, I visit the Academy and interact with some of you folks, and you are the future, and I am tremendously encouraged by what I see in each and every one of you. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a new form of engagement called faith-based diplomacy. But let me just give you some strategic backdrop. For several decades now, defense planners in the Pentagon have been wrestling with what is called the asymmetric threat. And for any of you not familiar with that particular term, it means an attack by unconventional or creative means that a disadvantaged opponent will use against a more powerful adversary, much like bin Laden did on 9/11, rocked our country back on its heels. In response to that, they came up with a new concept called irregular warfare, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with by now. This is about 5 years ago, in calling for a much tighter integration of defense, diplomacy, and development. And that's all to the good. But I submit to you that there is not enough money in Western treasuries to protect any country against the full spectrum of possible asymmetric threats. And I think what you really need is an asymmetric counter to that threat that gets at the ideas behind the guns. Now that sounds reasonably straightforward, but it's made more complicated by the religious nature of those ideas. And as we have readily seen in Iraq, Afghanistan, the United States has very little ability to deal with religious differences in a hostile setting. Nor do we have any ability to counter demagogues like bin Laden or before him Milosevic, who manipulate religion for their own purposes. And I find it supremely ironic that here we are, one of the more religious countries on the face of the planet, and we're so at sea in our inability to deal with these religious imperatives that permeate today's geopolitical landscape. There are several reasons for it. One is our long-held commitment to the rational actor model of decision-making, which has governed our practice of international relations for as long as I can remember. But in that model, religion is not on the screen. It's deemed to be irrational. So we just simply haven't known how to deal with it. And when you couple all this with this looming specter of the possible marriage of religious extremism with weapons of mass destruction, it just drives home the urgency of needing to fill this gap. One new form of engagement that has shown a great deal of promise in this regard is what I call faith-based diplomacy. What that means is at the macro level, it simply means incorporating religious considerations into the practice of international politics. At the micro level, it means making religion part of the solution in some of these intractable identity-based conflicts that exceed the grasp of traditional diplomacy. And by identity-based conflict, I mean ethnic or tribal or religious hostilities, these sorts of things. Excuse me. If you want to get into it deeper, at faith-based diplomacy, I would recommend that you consider reading this book called Religion, Terror, and Error. The subtitle is U.S. Foreign Policy and the Challenge of Spiritual Engagement. But it's really a how-to book on 3 scores. First, how to incorporate religious considerations into the practice of U.S. foreign policy. 2, how to develop a process, a model that for decision making that does incorporate things like religion or non-state actors. And there, what I suggest is modeling it after the OODA loop, which some of you must be familiar with, conceived by an Air Force colonel some time ago, which is, we don't have time to go into it here, but it is a process that works for international relations as well as air-to-air combat. And then finally, a how-to book on how we might proceed as a nation state to a new leadership paradigm, one that where we lead less by force and more by example. In this multipolar world that awaits, it seems to me like this will probably be something that we will want to learn how to practice better. One of the things the book does too is it looks very hard at existing resources that we have that could be channeled more effectively in the direction of dealing with these kinds of problems I'm talking about. Amongst the existing assets are your military chaplains, NGOs like our own, and the American Muslim community. And it also goes into additional factors that would need to be brought into being to deal with this whole thing. Rather than get bogged down in that, I'll just commend it to your reading. And if you want to purchase a copy of the book, you can do it off our website at dealer's cost, far cheaper than Amazon, and we'll inscribe it for you and all that sort of stuff. And you can sign up here if you're interested in looking at it. One thing I would do, though, is I want to read a couple of sentences from the foreword, which was by General Anthony Zinni, who was used to be CENTCOM when he was fighting our wars over there, and then later became U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East. Here's what he says. He says, "This is a visionary approach that goes beyond the whole of government effort and which expands the current definition of smart power. From my 2 decades of experience in the Islamic world, I am convinced that the vast majority of Muslims would embrace this approach as a means of clearly expressing their beliefs and enabling them to understand ours." So one of the things I became very impressed with was General Zinni's grasp of things all the way from the spiritual down to boots on the ground. Quite an impressive military leader. Anyway, since our inception, our center's inception in 1999, we've been practicing this form of engagement in different parts of the world, different trouble spots. Back in the early days, it was Sudan and Kashmir. More recently, we're talking about Syria and Pakistan. The most strategic of about a dozen different trouble spots we've worked have been Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And what I'd like to do is just focus the rest of this a little bit on Pakistan so you can understand the kind of work that NGOs can do that governments find very difficult to do. In starting, it's probably good to remind ourselves of the illustrious history of these religious schools, which few in the West are mindful of. But back in the Middle Ages, they were without peer as institutions of higher learning. And it was European exposure to them that led to our own university system in the West. So you'd be shocked at how many of the traditions and mores of academe trace their roots back to the madrasas, from the mortar boards and tassels you wear at graduation to funding a chair in a given discipline. It goes on, and it shouldn't be a surprise because they were the model. We've just sort of forgotten that. Also, while they were the best of the best and without peer, under the influence of colonialism and fearful of losing their Muslim identity, they purged themselves of all subjects that were deemed to be either Western or secular in nature, to the point where the vast majority of these madrasas today are about rote memorization of the Quran and the study of Islamic principles. What our goals have been there were twofold. One was to expand the curriculums to include the physical and social sciences, but with a very strong emphasis on human rights, particularly women's rights, and religious tolerance. The second goal, probably even more important, was transforming the pedagogy to create critical thinking skills among the students. In these tradition-bound tribal cultures, there's not a whole lot of room for creative thinking. So they don't have much of it. And what happens is you'll have these youngsters graduating from the madrasa who may have memorized the Quran from cover to cover, and the local militant comes along to recruit them to their cause, and they have no ability to question or to challenge. They don't even know what it is they've memorized in the Quran because they've had to memorize it in Arabic, and their first language is Urdu, And it's far earlier than they'll have enough Arabic to understand something as sophisticated as the Quran. So it's just, if they're asked to go or told to go off and fight Americans in Afghanistan, that's exactly what they do. So at this point in time, we have engaged more than 5,000 madrasa leaders from about 2,500 different madrasas in this kind of activity. That stands in marked contrast to the failed attempts of others to influence these schools, particularly the government of Pakistan. And the reasons for our success are about threefold. One is ownership. We've conducted this effort in such a way that the madrasa leaders feel it's their reform effort, not something imposed from the outside. And if you believe what you read in the media about madrasas, for example, you would think that these were nothing but seedbeds of terrorism with a caveman mentality to go with it. And that's really not the case at all. And what I'd like to do is I want to read for you the introductory paragraph in our teacher awareness module that we teach in our workshops. And this was crafted by a madrasa leader. Here's what he says. He says, "I've come to a frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. My personal approach creates the climate. My daily mood makes the weather. As a teacher, I have a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it's my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated and a child humanized or dehumanized." That's very powerful stuff, and I would be hard-pressed to come up with something half that good myself. So we work with these folks, and they have a lot of ownership in that change process. The second reason for our success is inspiring them with their own heritage, not only of the schools themselves, which I just shared with you, but going back to the early days of Islam. And so many of the pioneering breakthroughs in the arts and sciences took place under Islam, including religious tolerance, at a time when Christianity was woefully intolerant. So the more we talk about that, not excessively, but you find these folks stand a little taller and they say, hey, maybe we can do better ourselves. So it is a source of inspiration. And finally, the third, and I think probably the most important reason, is we ground all suggested change in Islamic principles, so they can feel like they're becoming better Muslims in the process. And they are. So what I'd like to do at this point to bring it a little more alive for you is share a couple of anecdotes that sort of suggest how you can get at this business of the ideas behind the guns. In one of our workshops, one of the participants was a Taliban commander of some renown, and he was despondent. He lost 2 sons in the fighting, and he said, "We don't know what America wants. He says, you come after us with guns, we've got no recourse but to respond in kind." So this led to an invitation for me to come to the mountains to tell their senior leadership what America wants, which I did 2 months later. In the interim, I made the rounds at State, Defense, and the agency to make sure whatever I said was consistent with U.S. policy, and find myself in a compound up in the mountains in the Malacan Agency, which is right near the Swat Valley, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. But it's up in the heart of darkness. I walk into this room, and there's 57 Taliban commanders and several tribal and religious leaders. And I told them, I said, you know, we're not a government agency, and we haven't received any funding from our government. But what we're here to do is to try to see if we can seize upon religious values that we share in common to create a confidence-building measure that can point toward peace. And I said, for you to be able to do that, you need to understand the Western perspective on what's going on here. So I told them what America wants, which was simply put to lay down their arms, distance themselves from Al-Qaeda, and to reconcile with the Karzai government. And this led then to about 2.5 hours of dialogue between them and me. There was a lot of venting that went on, as you might imagine. And during the course of that, there were about a half a dozen rather penetrating questions that emerged. First was, what do the American people want? And I said, well, what the American people want is peace in the region with democratically stable governments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then they wanted to know why we were fighting Islam. And I said we were not. It was important for them to understand how many times the United States had intervened on behalf of Muslims in Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, Kuwait. And I said, you have to take that into account as you make your calculations. The third question was, why are you attacking Afghanistan? And I said, well, to put that in terms that you hold dear, hospitality, loyalty, and revenge, I said, before we recognized certain members of Al-Qaeda as a threat, we welcomed them into our country, we gave them hospitality, and then on 9/11, they struck without warning. We wanted revenge, so we went to the Afghan government to turn over the Al-Qaeda leadership. They refused, so we attacked. I said, but we did so with a heavy heart, because most Americans have great admiration and respect for the Afghan people stemming from our common struggle against the former Soviet Union. And I said, furthermore, you need to recognize that some of your tribal leaders are now banding together against Al-Qaeda because they have violated your hospitality. Then they wanted to know why we were fighting in Iraq. And I said, I took a little license there. I said, there's a lot of debate about that. I said, but as far as I was concerned, that too was probably a matter of revenge because Saddam Hussein had attempted to assassinate a U.S. president. And then they wanted to know why we supported Israel. I said, well, I sort of punted there too. I said, you know, we have a strategic relationship with Israel. It's not going to change anytime soon. I said, but what is changing is our understanding of compassion for and support of the Palestinian people. I said, over time, that's going to make a real difference. Well, at the end of the 2.5 hours, we broke for prayer time, and then came back in a smaller group to try to come up with the confidence-building measure. Along the way, during that 2.5 hours, one very tough gentleman stood up and pointed his finger at me. I later learned that some of the folks there were Al-Qaeda, and I'm glad I didn't know it at the time, but I suspect he might have been one. But he pointed his finger at me and he says, I can't talk to you unless you become a Muslim. And I thought for a minute, and I said, well, I don't see a problem. I said, Muslim means submission to God. We all submit to God, therefore we're all Muslims. So we laughed and went on with our business. Later on, I learned that that scenario, the standard scenario, is you convert or you die. And of course, I was totally oblivious to that at the time, and I thought to myself, the Lord really does look out for fools and incompetents. But another thing that came up in that session, I really want to highlight to you. There was a young man who was probably in his very early 30s, and he was a leader of 350 Taliban fighters in Kunar province, which was just a little bit south across the border from where we were, where a lot of fighting was going on. And it's one of these kind of people, you see him for about 5 minutes and you are impressed that this guy has natural leadership skills. And he spoke up at one point and he said, you know, I and my wife were walking one day. He says, I was totally opposed to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. He says, and we were stopped and frisked by the American military. And we were made to put our hands in the air, and there was copious profanity being used. He says, I was made to feel humiliated in front of my wife. And so he went over. And one of the title that all the other Taliban commanders addressed him with was a very laudatory title in their culture, which is engineer, one who gets the job done. And I've often wondered, you know, how many body bags come back to the United States because the engineer is getting the job done, all because of a gratuitous insult in a culture where honor is everything. And so I'd like to think that wouldn't happen again. One can think of any number of reasons why that sort of scenario might occur, but you really need to be smart about these things. You can let your emotions run with you and end up with very counterproductive results. So we went into the room, we crafted a confidence building measure which called for establishing a secure zone in the western third of Nuristan. That was the Afghan province right across the way. Because all of these commanders seemed to genuinely care about their people, and they were mortified that of the billions of dollars flowing into the country, none of it had made its way down to the village level. And so this was a way to sort of bypass the fact of the government ripping them off or the warlords ripping them off. Unfortunately, I could not get enough traction with NATO to make this happen. So that was, I would have to call that attempt at a confidence building measure a failure. But where it did pay off was several months later, I received a call from the Korean ambassador to the United States asking if there was anything that our center could do to help secure the release of the 21 Korean missionaries that were being held hostage by the Taliban. 2 of them had already been killed, and there were 21 remaining. And because of the networking associated with that